Finishing a novel is a monumental task, and even though it takes months and sometimes years for people to finish that grueling first draft, a lot of people actually spend more time in the editing process. It can be really overwhelming though to jump right from drafting to editing, so today we're going to cover 3 methods to help you get the ball rolling there. And because it's right after NaNoWriMo season, I'm really excited to be talking about edits because I've been getting a lot of questions and requests for different types of edits of different degrees. So I think all 3 of these methods are a good way to evaluate where your manuscript is and sort of where you have to go from here to improve it. But welcome to Bound by Words Storytellers. My name is Madii. I am a full-time editor and fantasy writer, and I post writing-related videos twice a week. I'm accepting manuscripts for like the early springtime next year. If anyone needs copy edits or developmental edits, my information for all of that is always down below. And before we start talking about the methods of editing, I think there's a few things that you have to know like before you jump right in. The first is, are you going to let your manuscript rest or are you going to jump right in? And I think there are pros and cons to both. A lot of people like to really step away from it and come back with a really objective eye and viewpoint to edit, and a lot of people like to take advantage of that exciting energy that they just finished a novel. So I would definitely respect, what do you feel like you're mentally able to do? If you were really excited to get started editing right away, but you just really need a mental break, I think it's best to take it. Vice versa, if you had planned to let it sit and you got really excited about, what methods that you're planning on using to edit, I think you should jump on some of that energy and utilize it while you have it, because the muse doesn't always hit. There's nothing really wrong with editing right away. It works for some people and it doesn't work for others, and it's important that you find a system and a process that works for you. There's a lot of prescriptive advice on the internet, meaning there are a lot of people who say you should do this or you have to do it this way to do it correctly, and nearly none of those are true. What is correct is the way that you do it that works best for you and your creative system to help you tell a better story. It's about progress and not always perfection, and perfection doesn't look the same for everybody. So our 3 methods of working on developmental editing. The first one, and one of my favorites, is to perform a reactive reread. This one's great because it doesn't matter how experienced you are, it doesn't matter how put together your manuscript is, or really how you're going to go about developmental editing, because this is really just digesting what you have written and completed. I will say the goal for a reactive read, emphasis on the word read, is to not really make a lot of written changes if this is the path you choose. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. I will say if you're doing this on a computer, so if you typed it in Word or Scrivener and you're reading, go ahead and change the typos and the little grammatical errors that accidentally slipped their way through, but try to avoid doing any large rewriting. And the only reason for that is because you want to take this stage to really digest what is happening in your manuscript and what kinds of things you want to improve. I think a great way to do this is to color code highlighters and pens to mark different types of changes you want to make. If you don't think that you'll be able to read without making extensive changes, then I recommend using a PDF or an e-reader, or you can even print it out. There's something aesthetically pleasing about using a hard copy of your manuscript to really make notes and flags and highlight and stuff like that. So if that's what motivates you to get the ball rolling with editing, I think that's wonderful. But you can mark things you think are wordy, things that you want to cut. You can, have one pen color for stuff you want to add. You can have one pen color for stuff that confuses you. One pen color for there needs to be more emotional connection here. You can do any kind of marking or color coding that you want, but the goal with this type of edit in the first edit should always be larger things, bigger picture developmental editing. That's one of the 2 reasons I said to stay away from some of the rewriting. The first one is because you want to focus on the larger things. The second one is there are some things that you might want to change, remove, or add that are gonna be different and shift by the end of the novel. For example, if you're working on developmental editing and you're changing chapter 1 and you're like, I don't know why this is here, doesn't make any sense, I'm just gonna go ahead and remove it. Maybe that was something that you went back to and incorporated in chapter 5 or 10 down the line and you didn't remember. So just for consistency's sake, we want to absorb more than we change in this stage. And for that reason, I think it's great to have a note-taking system in place. Do you want to take notes on your manuscript? Do you want to take them on scene cards, on your outline, or even just in a separate notebook, sort of in a to-do list style? I don't think you should choose between note-taking and the color coordinating and marking. I think those things work really well hand in hand. end. I recently made a video on reading like a writer where I talk about how you can read for pleasure and really get a lot out of it. And I think this is sort of along the same lines whenever you're editing. You're reading in the same style where you're trying to like bookmark your emotional reaction and bookmark where you're confused and bored without having to do all of the editing. So it's no different than reading like a writer for a book that's published. The only difference is this is an earlier stage of the work. And everyone's going to be different, but for the most part, you're probably going to want to write down more notes than you think you are. You might go into it with a color-coded system saying, I'm just going to color code all of these things and that's it. I'm not going to worry about anything else. But then you're going to hit parts where you're going to be confused, or you're going to want to reconstruct it, or maybe you have a brilliant idea. Maybe you get 25% into your book and you have this aha moment of how to make a certain character deeper or how to make a character arc better and stronger. So I would definitely just pre-plan for note taking. And none of this is permanent. Maybe the way that you color code or take notes changes throughout your manuscript when you're doing this reactive reread. If that ever happens, I just recommend making like a key or a log and marking where it switches. That's perfectly okay as well. Like I said, the objective of this is to get a good snapshot of what's going on, how many things you want to change. I like the idea of using different colors to mark certain subplots and like areas that I think are wordy, areas that I want to remove or condense, because that gives me a good idea when I step back of what types of larger edits I'm going to have to make. For example, if I'm highlighting everything in blue that needs to be condensed, so it's information I want to stay in the book, but I described it in a way that was wordy, lengthy, or unnecessary, and I step back and I'm like, okay, well, I have, blue in every single chapter. I can go in and tackle just the blue parts first to make my story more concise and impactful, and then I can shift to something else whenever I move on to editing. Maybe I shift next to adjusting different subplots and stuff like that. So I think it just sets up a really nice foundation for moving into different types of developmental editing. But there are endless ways to go about this. And method number 2 that we're going to talk about is to rewrite everything. And I know this is going to sound really scary to a lot of people because you're like, I just wrote the book, I don't want to rewrite everything. And not only that, but if I'm rewriting it all the same, how is it going to improve? I will say that you're going to be a better writer at the end of the book than you were when you started. You will definitely have a better grasp of the story, the characters, the tone. You might even have a better grasp of your own author voice or the way that you like to describe things. So you might go through and rewrite chapter 1 with the exact same interactions happening, the exact same setting and body language, but you're able to describe it in a way that is more natural or fits better with the rest of the story. You grew a lot as a writer in your journey, so I think that you can benefit a lot from rewriting the exact same story with your new skill set. I think this would actually work for a lot of people, and I don't know if she does it anymore, but a popular YouTube creator here on AuthorTube, Sarah LaBrat, has made vlogs in the past where she was just highlighting everything, and as she went through and rewrote stuff, she would remove the highlighted sections. And I honestly tried that with a few things, and it worked really well. You would be surprised because as an overwriter, and I'm sure this would work well for underwriters as well, but as an overwriter, I was able to look at that and say, okay, I could have gotten all the information I got from that 1 or 2 paragraphs in just a couple of sentences. I also have a bad habit, and this is just something personally that I'm aware of, that I will brainstorm a little while I write. So if I don't know exactly what I want to happen next in the story, I might have a little bit of fluff material just while I am feeling out the characters' mood and tone as they're shifting from one thing to another. And that transitional period can usually be cut out or condensed very small because it's boring and unnecessary. So going through and rewriting gives you the opportunity to do that. You improve your, prose and sentence structure and your tone because you're a better writer, and you can also remove some of the unnecessary material and fluff that worked its way into your manuscript. Likewise, if you are an underwriter, you can see some areas where you're like, I can feel white room syndrome here, or I don't feel very emotionally connected, and you can work in more details, more tension, stuff like that as you're writing without really changing anything big about the manuscript. I will say this second one, I think works best if you supplement it with creating an outline or scene cards as you're going through this edit and marking these things and making these changes, so that whenever you're done, you can dip back and do some developmental editing. So you'll have a newly cleaned up and pieced together manuscript that's in a slightly better shape than it was in the first place. You'll also have an outline to work with where you can say, okay, here are my points that I really need to grow, some things I need to join together, connect, remove, and all of that jazz. It can be a little bit tricky whenever you're learning to developmental edit, especially if this is one of your first few books or if you're trying something new, to pick up a new system. We had this rule when I worked at Starbucks that if we had a new system, you had to do it for 2 weeks, even though it was uncomfortable and weird before we were allowed to change anything, because there's going to be an adjustment period. So when you go into this developmental edit, if you're just starting, there's going to be an adjustment period, and some of it might be a little bit rough or harder to get used to. So I don't think there's anything wrong with, mixing types of developmental editing strategies. For example, doing the rewriting everything while also creating an outline or scene cards. But I do think you should get used to sort of one thing or one system at a time. So whatever system you do choose, if you do choose to do 2 things like that on top of one another, I would set some expectations for yourself. Even just a bullet point list of, while I rewrite everything, here are the things that I want to write on my outline so I can go back and edit them later. Something easy and simple like that. But there is a chance that you might start one type of editing and a couple weeks in you might realize that it's just not going to work for your manuscript. It's okay to switch the plan then. I would start over at the beginning so you can have the same consistent adjustment period. And sometimes there are things that might not be the most fun and you might not like, but they might really help your manuscript. So be patient, give everything a shot. The third method that we're talking about today for beginning developmental edits on a new novel is to find a new plotting method. If you are a pantser, find a plotting method in general, and if you are a plotter and everything was plotted out, find a different plotting method. This one's a little unorthodox, but I think it works for a lot of people because there is a science to storytelling. There is something as readers that we expect to happen. We know that we're going to get a hook at the beginning. We know that we're going to see the characters original real world before we have an inciting incident. Then we're going to have a fun and game section, and these are terms that I'm using that are used in 1 or 2 plotting methods, but the plotting methods themselves are just different ways to describe the same story arc. There are different ways to approach the same story arc because they work, but not everyone's brain works the same way. So even though there is this tried and true story arc that every story can really be put into, writers and creative people are going to have different ways to think about it, just like readers are going to feel differently whenever we're reading it. We don't read books and always feel the same, even though we know sometimes that there's going to be a false victory or a false failure. We know the climax is coming up, and that doesn't make it any less exciting for us. In the same way that happens to readers, writers have different approaches to planning and plotting things. So if you are a pantser, it is good habit, just to be familiar with these plotting methods and storytelling tactics. Actually, whether you're a pantser or a plotter, that's true for everybody. It's good to be familiar with storytelling, techniques and methods if you tell stories in general. But if you are a pantser, even though you're not using them regularly and you're not using them to plot your novel, it's good to be familiar with them. And whenever you're going through in your editing, you're going to want some guidance on which things work and which things don't work. And I think always writers should use their own self-editing tools before they seek professional help. As a professional editor, I can tell you that every once in a while I'll get a manuscript and I can tell that the author didn't really spend any time cleaning it up before they sent it to me. They just wanted me to fix it. And the best thing that you can do for your novel is to get it in the best shape possible before having anyone else give you comments or reviews. And your best shape might be the first or second draft and your best shape might be the 10th draft, but you should spend some time working on your story to make it as best as you think you can make it before getting that feedback. One of these tools that you can use to do that are these well-known story structures. So you wrote a story and it's done, and you're looking at it and you're like, well, what parts work and what parts don't work? Line your story and your outline up to a traditional or standard storytelling method, it doesn't matter which one, and see if there are points that you hit and points that you miss. If you're the middle of my story feels weak, and then you're noticing in a lot of different plotting methods there are a lot of beats or notes or whatever you want to call them, plot points, that you didn't really hit or weren't very high stakes or didn't have a good reaction from your main character, you can then address it using the guidelines from the plotting system, even if you didn't use it to plot your book. Now, as a plotter, if you used a plotting system to plot your book, use a different one. And this sounds funny, but using a different one is going to give you different descriptions and different ways to look at the things that are happening in your novel, and it's gonna help you see if there's anything you can strengthen or any plot holes. I think this works especially well if you're going from a less structured type of outline to a more detailed and rigid structured type of outline, but that's not necessarily like a it won't work otherwise kind of statement. I just think that if you have like an easy or thin outline, for example, I'm using the take off your pants method for the book that I'm reading now, and it has a lot less plot points in it from start to finish. Still has a decent amount, but a lot less than the 3-act story structure, which is like really broken down point for point. So if I plot and plan my novel using this system that has less points, that is the exact same storytelling method as the 3-act story structure, but thought about differently, made a little bit easier, described in different words to tickle different like brains to get the creative juices flowing. If I use this to plot my novel, then when I transfer it to the 3-act story structure, it's going to be the same shape, but it will highlight some things that might be different, and those are points that I can use to grow. And I think this works with almost every outlining system. The only thing I would recommend is use an outlining system that works for your genre and your audience. I wouldn't use an outline system that is like made specifically for horror or screenplays. If you're writing like YA fantasy or fiction, it's not going to give you the best results. You might be able to get something out of it, and I think it's great to write in different genres, but you wouldn't want to use an outline that is designed for a story very different from your own to do any of your developmental editing. Not only is it interesting to see your story described in different words by these different systems that use, slightly different plot points to describe the same things, but it also makes it feel a little bit like a puzzle, which I think is kind of fun. But no matter which of these 3 methods you choose, or no matter which of the hundreds of other options you choose, one of the most important things is to focus on the why things are happening more than the how. A lot of us get caught up in the here's the story, plot. How is it happening? How is it interesting? How is it gripping the reader? But why is it happening? Why is this important to your plot? Why does this moment, why does this character, why does this, instance matter to what is happening to the rest of your story? Because if it doesn't matter, it arguably might not need to be there. So with that, let me know if there are any developmental editing methods that you think work really well for you down in the comments below. That way other writers can, learn from your trial and error or your experience. A lot of us think very similarly, and it can be, I think, an indispensable tool to just share the way that you edit so that other people can hear and get ideas for their own. And remember to like the video and hit the subscribe button. I post writing related content twice a week, and I'll see you guys next time.